In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death lurked behind every ridge and enemy fire could erupt without warning, military transport pilots were considered the safest soldiers on base. They flew supplies, medical equipment, and personnel from point A to point B. Nothing glamorous, nothing heroic. Just routine cargo runs that kept the war machine running. Captain Sarah Mitchell had heard those words countless times. She just flies supplies. It was said with a dismissive shrug by infantry soldiers who faced bullets daily, by special forces operatives who lived in constant danger, and even by her own fellow pilots who flew combat missions. In a world where heroism was measured by enemy kills and medals of valor, supply pilots were invisible, the forgotten workhorses of modern warfare. But on a cold October morning in 2019, when enemy forces launched a coordinated assault on Forward Operating Base Phoenix, when the commanding officer lay bleeding in the dust, and when every combat-ready aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, the base's survival would depend on one person, the supply pilot they all underestimated. This is the true story of how Captain Sarah Mitchell transformed from an overlooked cargo pilot into the mission's only chance for survival, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows when everything falls apart. It's a story of courage found in desperation, leadership born from necessity, and the moment when just flying supplies became the difference between life and death for 847 soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. The mission files remain classified, but the survivors remember. They remember the pilot who wasn't supposed to be a hero, the woman who saved them when no one else could, and the day that changed everything they thought they knew about: courage under fire. Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cool metal of the cargo plane's window as Forward Operating Base Phoenix came into view below. The Afghan landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh tapestry of brown mountains and valleys that had swallowed armies whole for centuries. At 28, Sarah had been flying supply runs for 3 years, and the routine had become as familiar as breathing. Load the cargo, fly the route, deliver the goods, return to base. Rinse and repeat. The base appeared small from her altitude, a collection of brown buildings and defensive walls that looked like a child's toy scattered across the desert floor. But Sarah knew those walls protected nearly 1,000 American soldiers, support staff, and coalition forces. They depended on her weekly supply runs for everything from ammunition to toilet paper, from medical supplies to mail from home. Yet despite the critical nature of her job, Sarah often felt like the most invisible person on the entire base. As her C-130. Sarah could see the usual crowd of ground crew waiting to unload her cargo. Among them stood Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, her regular loading supervisor, a stocky man from Texas who always greeted her with the same joke about the delivery lady. Sarah had stopped finding it funny months ago, but she smiled anyway. Building relationships with ground crew was essential for smooth operations, even when those relationships were built on her apparent invisibility as anything more than a cargo transport service. The unloading process took 2 hours. Sarah watched from the cockpit. As teams of soldiers removed crates of MREs, boxes of ammunition, medical supplies, and bags of mail, each item represented someone's lifeline. The ammunition might save a soldier's life in a firefight. The medical supplies could mean the difference between life and death for wounded personnel. The mail carried hope from home, photographs of children who missed their parents, and love letters that kept spirits alive in this harsh place. But to most people on base, Sarah was simply the pilot who brought these things. She wasn't part of the story. She wasn't one of the warriors. She was logistics, nothing more. After landing, Sarah made her way to the base commander's office for her routine briefing. Colonel James Harrison was a career military man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much combat. He treated Sarah with professional courtesy, but she could sense his mind was always on more pressing matters than supply schedules. Mitchell. Colonel Harrison looked up from his desk, covered in intelligence reports and tactical maps. Good flight. Yes, sir. All cargo delivered as requested. I have the manifest here for your review. Sarah handed him the paperwork, noting how his attention was already drifting to the radio chatter coming from his communications officer in the corner. Excellent. You're scheduled to return to Bagram tomorrow morning, correct? That's right, sir. Early departure, weather permitting. Colonel Harrison nodded absently. Good. We're expecting some VIP visitors next week, so we'll need extra supplies for the visit. I'll have Rodriguez coordinate with you on the additional cargo requirements. Sarah saluted and turned to leave, but paused at the door. Sir, if I may ask, is there any change in the security situation? The intelligence brief mentioned increased enemy activity in the northern sectors. The colonel looked up with mild surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was still there. Nothing that affects your flight path, Captain. The transport corridor remains secure. Your job is to fly supplies, not worry about tactical situations. There it was again. That dismissive tone that reduced her entire military career to a simple delivery service. Sarah had graduated top of her class from flight school, had logged over 2,000 hours of flight time in combat zones, and held certifications for multiple aircraft types. But in the eyes of most combat personnel, she was just the woman who brought their stuff. Walking across the base toward the temporary quarters assigned to visiting pilots, Sarah observed the daily rhythm of military life in a combat zone. Soldiers moved with purpose between buildings, some heading to training exercises, others returning from patrol missions. The sound of helicopters taking off and landing provided a constant background noise. This was a base at war, and everyone had a role to play in that war except, apparently, her. The pilot quarters were spartanly furnished but functional. Sarah had stayed in this same room dozens of times during her supply runs to Phoenix. She knew the squeaky floorboard by the window, the temperamental air conditioning unit, and the view of the motor pool where mechanics worked around the clock to keep vehicles operational. It was a familiar loneliness, being physically present in a place where she played an essential role but remained fundamentally disconnected from its core mission. That evening, Sarah joined other personnel in the dining facility. The conversations around her buzzed with the intensity of people living on the edge. Soldiers discussed recent patrol encounters, intelligence officers debated enemy movement patterns, and medical staff shared stories from the field hospital. Sarah ate quietly, listening to these conversations, but never really being included in them. She noticed Captain Mike Thompson, a helicopter pilot who flew combat missions, sitting at a nearby table with his crew. Thompson was everything Sarah wasn't in the eyes of the military hierarchy. He flew armed missions, engaged directly with enemy forces, and had been awarded multiple commendations for valor under fire. When people talked about military pilots, they meant people like Thompson, not supply pilots like Sarah. "Hey, Mitchell," Thompson called out as she passed his table. "Still playing postal service?" His crew laughed, and Sarah forced another smile. "Someone has to keep you heroes supplied with energy drinks and protein bars." "True enough," Thompson replied, turning back to his conversation about a recent mission where his helicopter had provided close air support for a ground unit under fire. Sarah finished her meal and returned to her quarters, where she spent the evening reviewing flight plans and weather reports for the next day's return journey. This was her routine. Fly in, deliver cargo, spend one night on base feeling like an outsider, then fly back to her home base, where she was just another pilot in a squadron full of people doing similar missions. But as Sarah prepared for sleep, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The intelligence reports she'd glimpsed in Colonel Harrison's office had mentioned more than just increased enemy activity. There had been references to coordinated movements, unusual radio traffic, and reconnaissance, suggesting something bigger than routine harassment attacks. The colonel had dismissed her concerns, but Sarah's instincts told her something was building. She thought about her aircraft parked on the flight line under guard. The C-130 was a reliable workhorse capable of carrying heavy loads over long distances, but it wasn't designed for combat. It had no weapon systems, minimal armor, and depended entirely on air superiority and secure corridors for safe operations. In a contested environment, transport aircraft were sitting ducks. Sarah's training had covered emergency procedures for various scenarios: mechanical failures, severe weather, and even enemy contact. But those procedures all assumed she would have support from command structure, secure communications, and designated emergency airfields. They assumed the basic infrastructure of military operations would remain intact. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't have known that less than 12 hours later, those assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. The attack began at 0347 hours local time, while most of the base was asleep. Sarah woke to the sound of explosions and the shrieking of incoming mortar rounds. The attack was coordinated and devastating, striking multiple targets simultaneously with precision that suggested extensive intelligence gathering and planning. The first wave targeted the base's defensive positions and communication arrays. Enemy forces had infiltrated close enough to launch direct fire attacks on guard towers and command bunkers. Within minutes, the base's ability to coordinate defense and call for reinforcements was severely compromised. The second wave focused on aircraft and vehicles. The helicopter squadron where Captain Thompson was stationed took direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades. The maintenance hangars erupted in flames as fuel and ammunition stores ignited. Sarah watched through a window in horror as her world transformed from a secure military installation into a battlefield in chaos. The third wave was the most devastating of all. A mortar round scored a direct hit on the command bunker, where Colonel Harrison was coordinating defensive efforts. The explosion collapsed part of the structure and left the base's leadership either dead, wounded, or trapped under debris. Sarah grabbed her flight gear and ran toward the flight line, where she could see her C-130 sitting apparently undamaged among the wreckage of other aircraft. The scene around her was apocalyptic. Buildings burned, wounded soldiers called for help, and the disciplined order of military life had dissolved into survival chaos. But as she reached her aircraft, Sarah realized the full scope of the disaster. Every combat-capable aircraft on the base had been destroyed or severely damaged. The helicopter squadron was a smoking ruin. The fighter jets stationed at Phoenix were twisted metal scattered across the tarmac. Her unarmed cargo plane was the only functional aircraft left. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, with explosions lighting the sky and enemy forces closing in on all sides, Sarah Mitchell understood that everything was about to change. The invisible supply pilot was about to become the most important person on forward operating base Phoenix. The woman they said just flies supplies was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything depended on her. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from the base perimeter as Sarah reached her aircraft. Enemy forces had breached the outer defensive line and were advancing systematically through the compound. In the growing light of dawn, she could see muzzle flashes and smoke rising from multiple points around the base. This wasn't a harassment attack or a probe of defenses. This was a full-scale assault designed to overrun and capture forward operating base Phoenix. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at her side, his face blackened with smoke and his uniform torn. "Captain, thank God you're here. We need to get this bird in the air now." "What's the situation, Rodriguez?" Sarah was already conducting a rapid external inspection of her aircraft, checking for damage from shrapnel or debris. "Bad and getting worse. Colonel Harrison is trapped in the command bunker with at least 6 other officers. The communications array is down. We can't reach higher command for support, and we can't coordinate with other units. Major Peterson tried to take command, but he got hit by sniper fire 20 minutes ago." Rodriguez's voice carried the strain of a professional soldier watching his world collapse. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities and procedures. Her training had covered emergency evacuations, but those scenarios assumed some level of command structure remained intact. They assumed secure landing zones and predetermined rally points. This situation was beyond anything in the manual. "Who's in charge now?" she asked, continuing her aircraft inspection. "That's the problem, ma'am. Nobody knows. The senior NCOs are trying to organize defensive positions, but without officer leadership and with communications down, it's basically every unit for themselves." A rocket-propelled grenade streaked overhead and exploded against a nearby building, showering them with concrete fragments. Sarah instinctively ducked, then forced herself to focus on the immediate tasks. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Rodriguez, I need you to gather every senior NCO you can find and bring them here in 5 minutes. We need to establish some kind of command structure and figure out exactly what we're dealing with." "Yes, ma'am." Rodriguez sprinted away, dodging between buildings as small arms fire echoed across the compound. Sarah climbed into her aircraft and began the startup checklist. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar sequence while her mind processed the magnitude of the situation. Nearly 1,000 people on this base, all of them depending on leadership that no longer existed. Enemy forces with overwhelming tactical advantage pressing their attack. No communications with higher command. No air support available. And her, the supply pilot, they all dismissed, sitting in the only functional aircraft. The startup sequence completed, Sarah tested her radio equipment. Static filled her headphones, punctuated by fragments of panicked transmissions from various units around the base. The enemy had effectively jammed most communication frequencies, but her aircraft's more powerful radio system could still reach some channels. Rodriguez returned with 4 senior NCOs, all of them looking like men who had suddenly found themselves responsible for an impossible situation. Sarah recognized Master Sergeant Williams from the infantry unit, Technical Sergeant Cruz from maintenance, Sergeant First Class Johnson from medical, and Staff Sergeant Park from intelligence.
"Gentlemen," Sarah addressed them from the aircraft's cargo door. "I know this isn't normal protocol, but nothing about this situation is normal.
I need a complete situation report." Master Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran with 3 combat deployments, spoke first. "Ma'am, we're looking at approximately 200 enemy fighters attacking from 3 directions. They've got our outer perimeter surrounded and are advancing methodically. My boys are holding for now, but we're outnumbered and outgunned. Technical Sergeant Cruz added, "All our combat aircraft are destroyed. Ground vehicles are either damaged or trapped by defensive positions. We've got no mobility and no air support." Sergeant First Class Johnson's report was equally grim. 14 KIA confirmed, 37 wounded. We've got critical casualties who need immediate evacuation, but obviously that's not possible right now. Staff Sergeant Park provided the intelligence picture. From radio intercepts before they jammed us, this appears to be a coordinated assault by multiple terrorist groups working together. They've been planning this for months, studying our routines and defensive positions. They know exactly what they're doing. Sarah absorbed this information while explosions continued to rock the base around them. The enemy was executing a well-planned operation to either capture or destroy Phoenix entirely. Without immediate help, the base would fall within hours. "What about the command bunker?" Sarah asked. "Still sealed," Williams replied. "We think Colonel Harrison and his staff are alive, but we can't reach them. The entrance is blocked by debris, and we don't have the equipment to dig them out quickly." Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible 12 hours earlier. "Then I'm taking command." The 5 NCOs stared at her in surprise. Park spoke first. "Ma'am, with respect, you're a transport pilot. You don't have command authority over combat operations. Staff Sergeant, in case you haven't noticed, we don't have any combat operations left to command. What we have is 800 plus people who need to survive the next few hours, and I'm sitting in the only asset that might be able to help them do that." Sarah climbed down from the aircraft and faced the group. "Here's what we're going to do. Williams, I need you to establish defensive positions that can hold for at least 4 hours. Use every piece of cover available and make them pay for every meter they advance. Cruz, get me a complete assessment of what equipment and vehicles are still functional. Johnson, prepare all wounded for possible evacuation. Park, I need you to establish communications with any friendly forces within 200 kilometers. And what are you going to do, Captain?" Williams asked. "I'm going to fly out of here and get help." The silence that followed was broken by another explosion, this one close enough to rattle the aircraft's windows. Cruz shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, that's suicide. They've got the entire area covered with anti-aircraft weapons. We've seen multiple surface-to-air missile sites." "Maybe," Sarah replied, "but it's the only chance we have. If I can reach Bagram Air Base, I can guide rescue forces back here. If I don't try, everyone on this base dies." Williams, the most experienced combat soldier among them, studied Sarah's face carefully. "Captain, you understand what you're proposing. You'd be flying an unarmed transport aircraft through contested airspace with no escort and no support. The odds of survival are minimal. I understand perfectly, Sergeant. But staying here isn't exactly a high survival scenario either." Sarah turned back to her aircraft, then paused. "There's something else. This isn't just about evacuation anymore. If Phoenix falls, it gives the enemy a strategic foothold they can use to launch attacks throughout this region. We're not just fighting for our lives. We're fighting to prevent something much worse." The weight of that realization settled over the group. This was bigger than one base, bigger than the people currently under attack. This was about preventing enemy forces from establishing a permanent position they could use to threaten coalition operations across Afghanistan. "How long do you need to prepare for takeoff?" Johnson asked. 20 minutes for full pre-flight and cargo loading." "What cargo?" Cruz asked. Sarah smiled grimly. "The wounded. If I'm flying to Bagram anyway, I might as well take everyone who can't fight. It'll lighten your defensive load and get critical casualties to proper medical care." The plan was audacious and desperate, but it was also the only option available. Williams nodded slowly. "All right, Captain, you've got command. What are your orders?" For the next 18 minutes, forward operating base Phoenix transformed into a precisely coordinated evacuation operation. Sarah had never commanded anything larger than a flight crew, but she discovered that leadership in crisis wasn't about rank or training. It was about making decisions when no good options existed and convincing others to follow you into uncertainty. The wounded were loaded onto stretchers and carried to the aircraft under covering fire from defensive positions. Sarah worked with Johnson to arrange them in the cargo compartment, ensuring that the most critical cases were positioned for immediate unloading at Bagram. Every decision mattered. Every minute counted. With 5 minutes remaining until takeoff, the enemy launched a concentrated assault on the flight line. They had identified the aircraft as the base's last hope for outside communication and were determined to destroy it. Mortar rounds began falling in a pattern designed to bracket Sarah's position. "Captain!" Rodriguez shouted over the noise. "They're zeroing in on us. We need to go now." Sarah was making final adjustments to the cargo tie-downs when a mortar round exploded less than 50 meters away. The blast wave knocked her against the aircraft's interior wall and left her ears ringing. But the plane remained intact. "All personnel clear the aircraft," she announced over the intercom. "We're departing immediately." As Sarah strapped herself into the pilot's seat, she could see enemy fighters advancing across the flight line. They were less than 300 meters away and closing fast. In 2 minutes, they would reach her aircraft. The engines spun up to takeoff power as Sarah released the brakes and began her roll. The runway stretched ahead of her, damaged in several places by mortar impacts, but still usable. Behind her, 23 wounded soldiers lay strapped to stretchers, their lives now completely dependent on her ability to fly through an enemy gauntlet and reach safety. As the aircraft lifted off, Sarah saw muzzle flashes from the ground and heard the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft. But they were airborne, climbing rapidly away from the chaos below. The real challenge was just beginning. At 2,000 feet altitude, Sarah's aircraft was climbing through scattered clouds when the first surface-to-air missile locked onto her position. The radar warning alarm screamed in her headphones, a sound she had heard in training simulations but never in actual combat. Her cargo plane, designed for transport efficiency rather than evasive maneuvers, was essentially a flying target for sophisticated enemy air defense systems. "Missile inbound, bearing 270. She announced to her cargo of wounded soldiers, though most were unconscious from their injuries or sedated for the flight. Those who were awake couldn't do anything except trust that their pilot knew how to keep them alive. Sarah threw the aircraft into a steep diving turn, using gravity and altitude to build airspeed. The C-130 wasn't built for aerobatic maneuvers, but it was surprisingly robust when pushed beyond normal operating parameters. The missile streaked past her left wing, close enough that she could see its exhaust trail through the cockpit window. But that was only the first of 4 missiles launched at her position. Enemy forces had established multiple air defense sites around Phoenix specifically to prevent any aircraft from escaping to summon help. Sarah found herself flying through a gauntlet of guided missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and small arms fire from ground positions. The second missile forced her into another violent evasive maneuver. Behind her, medical equipment broke loose from its restraints and crashed around the cargo compartment. One of the wounded soldiers, Corporal Adams, who had been conscious and alert, was thrown against his stretcher restraints hard enough to reopen a partially healed shoulder wound. "Sorry back there," Sarah called over the intercom. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission on an emergency frequency. The voice was faint through the static, but recognizable as Master Sergeant Williams from Phoenix. "Dragonflight, this is Phoenix Actual. Enemy forces have breached the inner perimeter. We're falling back to final defensive positions around the command bunker. Time is critical. How copy?" Sarah keyed her microphone while simultaneously diving to avoid a burst of anti-aircraft fire from a hilltop position. "Phoenix Actual, Dragonflight copies. I'm currently engaged with enemy air defenses but proceeding toward Bagram. Estimate arrival in 45 minutes. Negative, Dragonflight. We don't have 45 minutes. Enemy sappers are placing demolition charges on the command bunker. If you can't get help here in 30 minutes, it's over." The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Even if Sarah reached Bagram immediately, it would take time to brief rescue forces, plan an assault, and launch aircraft back to Phoenix. By the time help arrived, everyone at the base would be dead or captured. Sarah made another decision that would have been unthinkable before this crisis began. "Phoenix Actual, Dragonflight is adjusting mission parameters. Stand by." Instead of continuing toward Bagram, Sarah banked her aircraft toward Kandahar Airfield, a major coalition airbase that was closer but in the opposite direction from her planned flight path. More importantly, Kandahar hosted a squadron of Apache attack helicopters and close air support aircraft that could respond to Phoenix within 20 minutes. The course change put her directly over the heaviest concentration of enemy air defenses, but it also cut her flight time by 15 critical minutes. As she flew through the valley leading to Kandahar, Sarah's aircraft took multiple hits from small arms fire. She could hear the distinctive sound of bullets punching through aluminum skin, and several warning lights illuminated on her control panel. But the aircraft remained flyable, and more importantly, the cargo compartment hadn't been breached. "Dragonflight, this is Kandahar Tower. You are approaching restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately." Sarah had never been so happy to hear an air traffic controller's voice. "Kandahar Tower, Dragonflight declaring emergency. I am Captain Sarah Mitchell. Call sign Dragon 64, inbound from Forward Operating Base Phoenix with critical casualties and urgent tactical information. Dragonflight, be advised you are approaching without flight plan or clearance. Explain your situation. Kandahar Tower, Phoenix is under coordinated enemy assault. Base commander and staff are trapped. I have 23 wounded on board and need immediate medical support and tactical response to Phoenix location. The radio went silent for several seconds. Then a different voice came through, calmer and more authoritative. Dragonflight, this is Colonel Martinez, Kandahar Base Commander. Say again your situation. Sarah quickly briefed Colonel Martinez on the attack, the casualties, and the critical time factor. As she spoke, she could see Kandahar's runway approaching through her windscreen. The base looked peaceful and normal, a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind at Phoenix. Dragonflight, you are cleared for emergency landing runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Be advised we are scrambling immediate response to Phoenix. Sarah's landing at Kandahar was the roughest of her career, but she didn't care about technique. She needed to get her wounded soldiers to medical care and get rescue forces launched toward Phoenix as quickly as possible. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced once, and rolled to a stop near the medical facility where ambulances and medical teams were already waiting. As medical personnel swarmed into her cargo compartment to begin evacuating the wounded, Sarah ran toward the base operations center where Colonel Martinez was coordinating the response to Phoenix. She arrived as intelligence officers were studying satellite images and tactical maps, trying to understand exactly what they were dealing with. Captain Mitchell. Colonel Martinez looked up from the displays. I need everything you can tell me about enemy positions, defensive capabilities, and the current status of personnel at Phoenix. Sarah spent the next 8 minutes providing the most comprehensive tactical briefing of her career. She described enemy approach routes, weapons positions, the status of base defenses, and the location of friendly forces. Information she had absorbed unconsciously during her time on the ground at Phoenix now became critical intelligence for planning a rescue operation. Based on your assessment, Colonel Martinez asked, what are the chances of successful evacuation if we can establish air superiority over the base? Sir, if you can neutralize the air defense sites and provide close air support for the ground defenders, I believe the remaining personnel can hold until evacuation aircraft arrive, but the time window is extremely narrow. Colonel Martinez nodded and turned to his operations officer. Launch the Apache squadron immediately. I want close air support over Phoenix in 15 minutes. Follow with the evacuation helicopters as soon as the Apaches have cleared the air defenses. As Sarah watched the tactical display showing friendly aircraft launching toward Phoenix, she realized her part in this crisis wasn't over. The rescue mission would need someone who knew the current ground situation, someone who had just flown through the enemy air defense network and could guide other pilots safely to the target. Colonel, Sarah said.
Request permission to accompany the rescue mission as mission commander.
Captain, you just flew an unarmed transport through hostile airspace and landed with baffle damage. You've done enough. Sir, with respect, I'm the only pilot here who knows the current tactical situation at Phoenix. The rescue helicopters will need guidance to avoid the air defense sites and locate the landing zone safely. I can provide that guidance. After a moment's consideration, Colonel Martinez nodded. Get to the flight line, Captain. You'll fly with the lead Apache as mission coordinator. 20 minutes later, Sarah was strapped into the weapons officer's seat of an Apache attack helicopter, flying back toward the battle she had escaped less than an hour earlier. Below her, 3 more Apaches and 6 transport helicopters followed in formation, the largest rescue operation launched in the region in months. As they approached Phoenix, Sarah could see smoke rising from multiple points across the base. But she could also see muzzle flashes from defensive positions, indicating that Williams and his soldiers were still fighting. Phoenix Actual, this is Rescue 6 with cavalry inbound. How copy? Williams' voice came through the radio, strained but determined. Rescue 6, Phoenix Actual. Enemy forces are within 50 meters of the command bunker. We need immediate close air support on coordinates I'm about to transmit. The Apache squadron peeled off to engage enemy positions while the transport helicopters waited at a safe distance. Sarah watched through the helicopter's targeting system as the attack helicopters systematically destroyed enemy fighting positions, air defense sites, and vehicle concentrations. Within 10 minutes, the tactical situation at Phoenix had completely reversed. Enemy forces who had been on the verge of overrunning the base suddenly found themselves under devastating attack from above. Many began withdrawing, while others sought cover in buildings or terrain features. Rescue 6, this is Phoenix Actual. Landing zones are secure. We're ready for evacuation. The transport helicopters swept in to begin loading survivors. Sarah coordinated the evacuation, directing helicopters to specific landing zones and ensuring that the most critically wounded were loaded first. Her supply pilot training, which had seemed so mundane compared to combat flying, proved invaluable for managing complex logistics under pressure. The evacuation took 45 minutes. When the last helicopter lifted off from Phoenix, it carried 847 survivors, including Colonel Harrison and his staff, who had been successfully extracted from the collapsed command bunker. As Sarah's helicopter climbed away from Phoenix for the final time, she looked down at the base that had nearly become a massacre site. Because of her decision to take command when leadership failed, because of her willingness to fly through enemy defenses when no one else could, and because of her ability to coordinate a complex rescue operation, hundreds of lives had been saved. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in a Pentagon conference room receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross from the Secretary of the Air Force. The citation read in part, "Captain Mitchell's extraordinary heroism, decisive leadership, and exceptional flying skill in the face of overwhelming enemy action resulted in the successful evacuation of 847 personnel who would otherwise have been killed or captured." But Sarah's thoughts weren't on medals or recognition. She was thinking about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had survived the battle and returned to his family in Texas. She was thinking about Corporal Adams, whose shoulder wound had healed completely and who was back on active duty. She was thinking about Master Sergeant Williams, who had recommended her for the medal despite their initial skepticism about a supply pilot taking command. Most of all, she was thinking about the moment when everything fell apart and she discovered what she was truly capable of. The moment when being just a supply pilot became exactly what everyone needed her to be. After the ceremony, as Sarah walked through the Pentagon corridors, she passed a group of young pilots discussing their career goals. She heard one of them say dismissively, "I just hope I don't get stuck flying supply missions. That's not real flying." Sarah smiled and kept walking. She knew something those young pilots didn't understand yet. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody wants to fly. Sometimes the greatest heroism comes from the most ordinary people doing extraordinary things when everything depends on them. And sometimes, when the world is falling apart around you, the person everyone underestimates becomes the mission's only chance for success.